We're trying some new technology tonight, and I'm taking you into the archives tonight. But back during the dark days of COVID, in the winter of 2022, I wrote a newsletter that focused on the archives, the inquiries we received, our research into these queries, and the outcome of those searches. And that particular edition of the newsletter got so many comments that I thought I would do something in a similar vein tonight. So I want to share stories of different generations of Eastham folk who went about their daily lives in an ordinary and yet to us somewhat extraordinary way. And all of these stories were found right here in the archives. So researching in the archives of the Historical Society is really an adventure. It's akin to that of searching for the proverbial pirate's treasure. We never quite know whether we're heading in the right direction, where our research will lead us, or what we'll find along the way. And rarely are our searches straightforward, and often we're amazed at the serendipitous finds that we stumble across. Serendipity and serendipitous are two of my favorite words, and they're sprinkled liberally throughout this talk. So tonight I'm going to share some of the hidden gems that are intriguing and interesting discoveries of Eastham's long and rich history as one of the Cape's earliest settlements. And it's told through the stories and the recollections of Eastham folk, past and present. So I'll start with the archives. I took a few pictures the other day, and very few people go downstairs into that climate-controlled archive area. But if you did, this is what you would see. And it looks a little bit chaotic, but we learn to navigate. On our website, it says, located in the 1869 Schoolhouse Museum, the archives take up much of the space in our climate-controlled basement. And I think, But what, might you ask, is down there? In short, a plethora of historical records. Documents, maps, photographs, artifacts, newspaper articles, journals, genealogical records and booklets, family trees, reference books, old newspapers and magazines, family histories, old town reports and records, cemetery records, historical property surveys, transcripts of oral interviews with longtime Eastham residents, focusing on life in early Eastham, and private collections that have been donated to EHS, books, postcards, photos, diaries, ship's logs, sets of scrapbooks, artifacts, and more. But for tonight's presentation, I've used the following resources extensively: our collection of oral history, interviews, and articles by the Society's past presidents in scrapbooks or in published newsletters. And of course, I have a thing for maps. So maps, photographs, and postcards, and some other articles. So on our website, you can read the story of how Joe Mistretta, in the mask, one of the masks, was dusting off some artifacts in the archives, and he came upon a real treasure. It was a document donated by Mr. and Mrs. George Myrick of Del Mar, New York. It was kept between two panes of glass, sealed with masking tape, and it was dated June 16, 1795. In it It appoints Elijah Knowles of Eastham as Justice of the Peace, and it is signed by Samuel Adams, Governor of Massachusetts. Yes, the Sam Adams, not the summer Sam Adams, the Sam Adams. And as you might imagine, all of us at the Historical Society were really excited about this find. And the story was picked up by newspapers on the Cape and off the Cape. And you can read all about it on our website. All you have to do is look for this photo of Joe and our president, Eileen Siebold. Go under Explore History and then Historical Documents tab. But I'm not going to tell this story because it's not just a story about an 18th century document. It's a story of an Eastham man and his commitment to his town, our town, as a public servant. In our searches of genealogy records in the archives and online, we found the following. Elijah Knowles was born in 1747. He married in his mid-20s to Rebecca Harding. He had 8 or 9 children, and that's what we found in the genealogies. So we began to look in the histories of Eastham and other town records to find mention or look for mention of his appointments to town government. Talk about being civic-minded. He was assessor for over 12 years. He served in the general court for 10 years. He was town clerk for 3 years, treasurer for 4. He was also on a committee that was tasked with drafting a petition to the general court for regulating fisheries. And he was appointed to a committee in 1795 to complete a survey of the town. And it was completed in May of that year. And the next month in June, that's when he was appointed Justice of the Peace. And that's the document that made the news. But I'm going to take a little bit of time to describe the survey map. One of the oldest in our map collections, because we have it displayed right out in the foyer in the next room. And it's a map that 3 men put together. It has the ponds, although they're all round. No differentiation. It has our boundaries, Wellfleet on one end, because Wellfleet had already formed in 1762, and this was 1795. And Harwich on the other end, because Orleans had yet to form, which they did in 1797, so Eastham went as far as Harwich. And here are some place names that are on this map. You'll recognize many of them because they're still some of the place names that we use. And you might think that country road ought to be county road. And I think you're right, because I did some searching in the archives, and in one of our histories, I think it was Enoch Pratt, I learned that county road was laid out from Harwich to Truro. Any guesses as to the year? 1720. So we're in 2020 now, so 300 years ago? I love that. I mean, these are the things that get me excited. I thought this was what we would find for Elijah Knowles. Imagine my surprise when we made another discovery in the archives. And I was working on cataloging maps and old photos and measuring them to send off to Boston Public Library to be scanned. I came across a series of gravestone rubbings, very fragile and very old. And lo and behold, transcribing them, I was struck by two particular names, Knowles and Myrick. Serendipity. Among the rubbings was one of the gravestone of Elijah Knowles, Esquire. So it appeared to be the same Elijah Knowles as the one in the Samuel Adams document, that deed. But I wasn't yet certain whether they were the same person or not. But soon enough, thanks to the newspapers that picked up that story, Amy Wharf McGigan, I think that's how you pronounce her name, wrote a follow-up article in the Provincetown Independent on rediscovering Elijah Knowles. And she writes about Knowles and his family and his service to Eastham. And she ends with, just months later, Elijah Knowles died at age 48. So I was able to corroborate that. And for us, the Adams Knowles document is part of the treasure, along with the survey map and the grave rubbing. But for me, the real value is found in the story of the man, Elijah Knowles. So I'm going to move forward about 100 years to 1882. These are from newspapers in our archives, and they're all from the 1800s, and I just took snippets of them. I'm going to connect the content of the articles I'll share with you to more recent Eastham history. It's part of my attempt to create a tapestry, let's say, of life in Eastham. And I'm going to use the help of Kate Alpert. Now, Kate was Kate Catherine Moore. She grew up in Eastham in the 30s and 40s, right down on Locust Road. She was a past president for many years of the Historical Society, and she wrote newsletters and articles, as did her mother, Catherine Moore, in Eastham. So I'm borrowing from Kate. I'm sure she won't mind. I'm giving her all the credit that is due to her. And she takes these old 1880 news articles, and relates them to her present. So I've chosen just a couple, and they really resonate with me, and that's why I want to share them with you. Here's an article. Oh, no, it's not. I'll tell you about the article. Here are some pictures that show. Skating parties have been quite the thing of late. This is 1882. On the large pond near the depot, on the moonlit eve of the 30th night, your correspondent counted 50 skaters. The shouts of laughter and glee heard from a distance spoke of high sport. I love that. Kate writes this: the pond where the skating parties took place was probably the pond behind the Eastham Library. In various years known as Long Pond, Mill Pond, Depot Pond, take your pick, she says. And then she writes, in our little neighborhood around Salt Pond, Locust, and Mill Roads, we skated on the swamps in back of the old Knowles Ott House, and on another swamp on Mill Road. The winters were much colder then, and when Mill Pond froze, we often held big skating parties, complete with roaring fire to warm those toes and fingers. In cold winters, Salt Pond would freeze. Whoa. So we would go careening down the hill and out onto the pond. She adds that it was without her parents' knowledge. And she admonished anyone reading this newsletter not to try it, because salt water isn't really safe, even if it looks like it's frozen. My own winter memories of the 50s and 60s include skating on what we called Aunt Jemima's Pond, just down Samoset. So, a little bit of a side note. I'm going to be giving a talk at the Council on Aging this fall, and it's called What's in a Name? And I'm always looking for explanation of the road names, the pond names, the place names in Eastham. And I've been searching for this for a few months sporadically. So Jemima Pond, we always called Aunt Jemima's. Did you call it Aunt Jemima? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Mom called it Aunt Jemima. You know, was one I was curious about. Well, I found the answer in our oral history archives, and it's in an interview with John Ullman in August of 1989. And I'm going to share that with you right now.
The period that I can discuss was run from about 1913 into the 20s. I was born in 1905, and by 1930 I was going on toward 8. And at this point, spending all my summers in Eastham, I had walked around every pond and through every pine woods and over every meadow. And I knew the town very well. But my relationship to Eastham goes back a bit farther than that. My grandfather was Freeman Cobb Hatch, and he was born on what is now called Samoset Road in the square white house now occupied by Louise, Missouri, but originally occupied by the Walter Hatches.
What did you think, Deb?
Spooky.
That's Debbie's father speaking to you from the archives. Just consider the wealth of information in that short paragraph. We learn that John Ullman is related to the Hatch family, and that Samoset Road wasn't always Samoset Road. And we know exactly where some Eastham folk, the Meserves, and the older Hatches lived. Here's a close-up of that part of the map. Now, Jemima is called Little Muddy Pond in this map. I don't know why, because Muddy Pond is our pond, you know, it's in the other corner. So I've marked in red the house where John Ullman was born, and the house where he lived his older life. And over there, that's the Eldad Higgins house in red, and I just put that in because that's the house my mom grew up in. And it was right down the hill from Jemima's Pond. Well, I discovered from the tape script, not the tape script, from listening to it, that Jemima Pond is named for Jemima Mimey Clark. And this was John's grandfather's aunt. And I recently discovered that my mother's foster mother, Addie Nickerson, who was the postmistress in Eastham, was also a Clark. I knew she was a Clark. But I just discovered that she had a Jemima who was her great-grand aunt. So Debbie, there's a relationship there. I couldn't find a clear map of the 80s because they're filled with writing, not only the place names, but who lived where. But about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we received a huge aerial map of Eastham from Scott White. And I've turned it on its side, and it's only a portion of the map, but I wanted it in the same orientation as the other maps that we had. So we have Great Pond, no question about which one is great, Deborah, the tiny little one, and then Long Mill Depot, whichever, take your pick. Little Depot, or the Ice House Pond, there were many ice house ponds. Jemima, Muddy, also known as Mill sometimes. Coal, Lawton, or Herring, depending on who lived there at the time, and when they built the Herring Run. Widow Harding, and Bridge. And I just love this aerial view.
What year is that, Martha?
It's not written on it. Scott told me when he gave it to me. I hope it's in the notes that he left me also. I think it's 70s, but I'm not sure. So, still thinking about Eastham's ponds and staying with the Hatch family for a little bit. Here is an old postcard. We got a request in the archives a couple of years ago. And Ice House Pond is in the foreground with the ice house. Great Pond is in the distance. And Jemima's at the far left. A longtime summer resident wrote and asked if we knew anything about the 5 Hatch family cottages on Great Pond and whether we might know the Indian names for them, because each one had been given an Indian name, probably by Freeman Hatch's wife, Hattie. In the 1920s, this young woman thought. So we looked in the archives, we looked through the scrapbook collection, we looked at all of Nobile's books to see if he had any mention of them. No, Eastham tidbits, no luck. But a serendipitous meeting at Swift Daley House with members of the Horton family, Sue and Ed. And Sue said, "Oh yes, I have a newspaper article." And guess who it was written by? None other than John Ullman. Apparently, Hattie got the names from Longfellow's poem, The Song of Hiawatha, and other sources of Native American history. So I've labeled those cottages, starting at the far left: Kinnickinnick, Kenosha, Kanawagwana, Kewadin, Kiwanis, and Kanjapati. And this was an article written in 1975 that we found this in. Just love it. Okay, the 1882 newspaper again, and back to Kate. This is a notice in the newspaper. It's an announcement of a meeting. Because I couldn't help but think, how do we get informed about upcoming meetings? We get sent emails, we get phone calls, it's put up on Facebook. What did they do in 1882? They had to put something in the newspaper, and people read newspapers. Here we go. Trustees of the church will please hereby take notice. A trustee meeting is called for by the pastor to be held on Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock at the store of A.H. Cobb. Will those who see this please be present and give notice to others? A full yearly report must be made out before Wednesday the 8th, and important business will be transacted. So Kate starts making connections in her newsletter between past and present. And I've put up a few photos to help you. Where am I going with this?
Where's Cobb's store?
Where's Cobb's store? Cobb's store is there, but it's not called Cobb's store.
It's the thrift shop.
It's the thrift shop, yes. Okay, so I will make all of these connections known to you. But at this time, I need to mention Fred Jewell. Frederick H. Jewell was a really good friend of mine. I've known him since I was in first grade. And we always went to Mr. Jewell's house. But he was one of the founders of the Historical Society, and he was its first museum curator. And he kept copious notes of everything and scrapbooks. And over 50 years ago, in August of 1973, he compiled a list of significant sites in Eastham, and he based his descriptions for these significant sites on several resources in the archives. Eastham's Tercentenary book, wonderful reading. Alice Lowe's Nauset on Cape Cod, Enoch Pratt's The History of Eastham, wealthy New Orleans too. And also, as he says, on hearsay. I'm sure that Kate used Mr. Jewell's notes, just as I do today. And here are the connections that she made from this short newspaper announcement. First, Millennial Grove and the Methodist Campground. The Methodist Campground meeting place started in 1828 on a 10-acre plot of land in what is now the Campground Road area. The Grove held preaching and prayer meetings every August, and thousands would come from on and off Cape to worship by foot, horse and buggy, and packet boats from the Upper Cape and Boston. And if folks were arriving by steamer, passengers were put into small boats, and then closer to shore at Campground Landing, they would be transferred to horse and wagons, which would pull them up onto the shore, and then they'd finally walk the final mile to Millennial Grove, the campground. Kate writes, apparently, engaging in prayer and meditation was not the sole purpose of attending the camp meetings, where accounts of gaiety and picnicking on the abundant seafood and lobsters, children romping in the open grounds, and adults enjoying the serenity of the area. And I'm going to include a little bit of hearsay here. I was at Eastham Historical Commission meeting and mentioned Millennial Grove, and Jay Camp said, oh, did you hear about the preacher? His name was Higgins, and he owned that hotel that was called the Travelers Hotel, and his wife attended all of the camp meetings, and she attended so many camp meetings, and she got very, very close with one of the other preachers. And this preacher from Eastham killed her. And he was put on trial at Barnstable County Courthouse, and he was acquitted by a jury of his peers, all white men. But 2 years later, he thinks he had second thoughts, and the preacher committed suicide. That's hearsay. I have not yet looked it up, but I'm going to. Back to Kate's newsletter. Interest in the campground started to wane in the 1850s, so it was only going on for about 20 years. It was when the Boston train was extended to Yarmouth in 1863 that the Eastham Grove was closed. And a new one was set up in Yarmouth because it was easier for people to get there. Think Camp Street, right off of Willow. And the Grove in Yarmouth is where the airport is now. We'll look at some other references. First, Cobb's store. Well, this is the oldest photo of Brackett's store that I could find. Kate says Cobb's store was built in 1879 and it became Sam Brackett's in 1886. And it was, as you know, well, most of you know, general merchandise, clothing, food, more, for animals, for people. And it had a delivery wagon that delivered straight to people's homes. And this is the wagon, and that's George Wiley, an uncle, who did the deliveries from here to Provincetown and back. And he hated it when it became a motorized truck. He far preferred the wagon and his horse. But the building today is the Council on Aging thrift shop on the corner of Massasoit and Oak Roads. And if you really want to find some treasures, you have to go visit that. And if you're interested interested in the history of the building, we have a video presentation that's posted on our Historical Society YouTube channel, all about the history, and it's really fascinating. As for the church trustees, the church that is mentioned is the Methodist Church. And Kate writes that this church was on the grounds of the Evergreen Cemetery on Route 6, right across the highway from Arnold's. And the church was destroyed by fire in 1920. This photo of the church is from a postcard dating to 1910. And it was published by George H. Clark in Eastham. Now, George Clark had a store, lots of people, at the railroad station, at the Eastham Depot. And shopkeepers at the time often published postcards. And they sold them to tourists and townfolk, because tourists were starting to come here in the late 1800s. And companies in Boston, a little aside, were starting to sell plots of land to people because they knew people from Boston would want to get out of the city and come down here. And the railway was here also, so it made that very easy. George's store, it also housed the post office and the library. The library was the second floor of that store on the right-hand side, and the post office was the right-hand door. And we heard in one of the tape scripts, and I don't remember which one now, that when the mail came in, he took his job as postman very seriously. And he closed the store until he had sorted the mail. And then once he had sorted the mail, he started with the A's, and he called out the name of the person who was getting the mail. Oh, I think it was your father's, it was John Allman's, because he was very upset that he was at the end of the alphabet. And never got everybody else got their mail before he did. The library moved right down the street to a new building in 1897. And I'm going to take a small detour here because as I read Kate's newsletter, I recalled another segment of John Allman's interview, which he mentions George Clark's store and what and why they would or would not shop for there. So this is what he has to say.
Supplies. You didn't go to George Clark's store and buy a 5-pound bag of flour. You went to Orleans and you bought a barrel of flour. And you didn't replace it until the barrel was pretty darn low. You bought your sugar. It might be a small barrel or a keg, but you bought quantities. You bought quantities of anything that would keep potatoes, turnip, anything like that. And you put them in a root cellar to keep. You didn't have any other way of keeping them. But this process was either weekly or every other week. And we would rent, I believe, on Dickinson's horse and cart. And we would drive to Orleans by Bridge Road. Bridge Road, are we still on our road? Yeah. Bridge Road was sand all the way. Just two tracks for the wheels, one track for the horse. And it took an hour because the horse walked. You'd say get up and he'd walk. You'd take a fly off his tail and he'd walk. That was his speed. And at 4 or 5 miles an hour, took about an hour to get to Orleans, so you'd spend the day there. You'd have a lunch with my grandmother. My mother would have packed it. It'd be a pretty copious picnic lunch, too. And you'd sit by the gravestone in the center of town while the men were shopping for hardware and the women were shopping for food. And you'd load up the wagon and back you'd come with it. And then the men would carry the heavy stuff in, the boys would carry the middle stuff. But you shopped in Orleans, you did. But George Clark, you went up to buy a loaf of bread or a quart of milk. I wondered about that. Yeah. No.
So I'm going to end this section right now of Millennial Grove with a story of Kate's father's grandparents, Winslow Moore and his wife Margaret. They lived in Salt Pond House, which is no longer there, but it used to be right on the main road at Salt Pond. And Kate writes about her thoughts about the value of our collection of interviews. And says, in the 1980 tape that my parents made for the Eastham Historical Society, my father tells a little tall tale about his grandparents going to the Millennial Grove for a meeting. Well, rather than hear this from my reading of Kate's writing, we'll listen to Morris Moore. And I have to tell you, when I played this for my brother, he recognized his voice right away because he knew he was a young boy. So this is all about the Millennial Grove.
I understood the way my grandfather Moore met my grandmother Moore was that he went to sea sometimes as the cook on a fish boat. And I don't know where it was, but anyway, he ran into my grandfather, Margaret Moore. My grandmother, Margaret Moore. Her name was Holden, and they say she came from Maine. And I don't know where he ran into her. Anyway, so he said something about, so I've been told, he said, well, we're going to camp meeting with me. And this is the way the story is. She said, I guess I don't go to a camp meeting with anybody I ain't married to, so he says, well,
And that was these camp meetings over here? That was these camp meetings over here? Yeah.
So that was the proposal by her. I love that little bit too. Kate says, this may be another more tall tale, but it was one of those Eastham tales told round the holiday tables, and it made its way to the Eastham Historical Society archival tapes. And I would venture to guess that there may be other tapes with a few tall tales thrown in, but the interview collection of Old Eastham is a wonderful history of the townsfolk no longer with us, who contribute to life and work in the town. And I have to say, I agree wholeheartedly. Our collection of interviews, we have about 100, it's a real treasure. And I read them or listen for pleasure. They're available online, you can listen to them, but the tape scripts are actually kept here. So Kate wrote another newsletter. We're done with old newspapers. And it was titled A Walk to the Eastham Library. And I would like to share that with you because the library always has been, and I think always will be, such a large part of our town's community. This is Kate's grandfather's house on Locust Road. And that, I think, is her grandfather with the hay on the horse and the grandmother putting it up into the barn. Kate writes, let's take a walk to the library. We'll start at my grandfather's house on Locust Road, the Moore House, circa 1830. Before taking the walk, however, we feed my grandfather's chickens, kept in 2 chicken coops in the woods behind the garage. And then, before proceeding out the driveway, my grandmother would call out the back door that if we went down to the apple orchard, she'd make us apple pie. Now, the thoughts of having warm apple pie for dinner, or supper, as we called it, with ice cream was enough to send us scurrying to the orchard to pick what I always thought, that's Kate, wormy apples. In reality, she says, they were not. I can still smell those apple pies baking in the old black iron stove in my grandmother's kitchen. And I have to mention here that Eastham had many orchards. Many families had apple trees, pear trees, I don't know what other kinds. But as a matter of fact, I learned, not hearsay, from my cousin right here, that there was an apple orchard at the Swift Daley house. Well, I knew that, but I didn't know what happened to that apple orchard. It got filled in when they bulldozed land up so that the new post office could be built at road level. Right? Did I get that right, Roger?
Very good.
So, did any of you besides Roger know that the Eastham post office sits on an apple orchard? I had to put this next one in. My own grandmother, Marina Daley, not only made apple pies from the fruit of that orchard, but she had a real home bakery, and she made all kinds of delicious baked goods, including hot donuts every morning. Okay, back to Kate and her walk to the library. So the chickens fed, the apples picked, out the driveway and across the street to what is now known as the Knowles Ott House. This house is probably the oldest house in the Old Town Center Historic District. The front portion, which is this one, gable roof house, was built about the mid-1700s. But the rear hip roof house was built in 1672 in Plymouth and then barged over to Eastham and then attached to the front portion. Now, buildings were barged over from Plymouth. Anyone know of another one very famous in Eastham that was barged over from Plymouth? The windmill, yes. That was dismantled and barged, first to Truro, or Provincetown, some people say, and then up to Eastham by the salt pond, and then down to where it is now by the windmill, yeah. So in 1882, John and Lucy Knowles owned the house. John was an asparagus farmer, and he had fields on both sides of Locust Road going as far as the railroad tracks. He also had a second enterprise, which was painting carriages in the barn that was on the property. And this sign that advertised his carriage painting business is in the Randlett Tool Museum on the grounds of the Swift Daley House. More connections, because the John Knowles family donated it to our tool museum there. So I love that. Lucy had a little shop selling fabric, postcards, and candy. And although John's barn is no longer there, the little shop that Lucy had is still on the property. And their great-granddaughter, Lucy, in this photo at 90, still owns the house. And last year it received the George Abbott Award for Historic Preservation last summer. And it's a beautiful, beautiful house to go in. And the Provincetown Independent wrote another great article about it with lots of photos, if you're interested. Kate is still on the way to the library. And in the early 30s, Mill Road did not go all the way to Locust Road. So Kate and her friends, she says we, walked through the Knowles Woods to Mill Road and past Tom Brown's house. Tom was the iceman, and he delivered ice to most of the houses since electric refrigerators didn't come until the late 30s or early 40s. And when the winters were cold enough, Tom would cut the ice from Ice House Pond. I'm assuming it's the Ice House Pond closest to where he lives, but you don't know because most of the ponds did have ice houses. And so I just couldn't corroborate which one it was. Kate writes, proceeding on Mill Road, one could hear the wail of a train off in the distance. And she says, it was a thrill to see the gleaming engine as it passed on the west side of Long Pond, making its way to Provincetown. Well, this isn't that same train, you can tell. It's in its later days. It's not quite gleaming. But Kate and her friends would stop at the pond and wade in the clear blue water And then they would walk up the stairs and into the library where Blanche Keefe, the librarian, held court at a small desk and greeted her with a cheery smile and assisted in finding the newest exciting children's book. And the children's section was just to the left of the front door. And it still was 20 years later when I was going to the library. But the librarian was Sadie Flint then. Blanche Keefe lives right next door, the very next house here. And her daughter, Bertha, was a teacher in Orleans. So, although, do I have the picture of the library? I do. And right next to the chapel in the Pines, that's the old library, and the steps that we would always run up to get into it. From an old postcard, of course. So, although she must have passed the windmill every single time she went to the library, in this newsletter, she did not focus on it. So I would like to, and I'm going to share a few photos of the windmill before the windmill green was built. Any ideas when that was made? 1958. And so here, most of these photos are before the green, and the very final one is an aerial after the green. So this is, when I was a kid, they still ground corn every summer at the windmill. This is the windmill when it was proposed to be the library, before the library, because the town owned the windmill then. And to save money, they thought they should use it as a library instead of building a new library. But and we have the prospectus of what, you know, in the archives, that's what they wanted to do with it. This is before the green, an old mill and the houses in front. This is Crosby Tavern. There were two Crosby Taverns in town, one on Bridge Road and one here. A couple of houses on the front. You can't see the windmill because it's over there. And then this is what I think used to be Mr. Gavin's, and now it's Meadow something. Meadow Marsh. This is when they're moving the houses. One of my classmates lived in this one that they're moving, Bradley Depledge. These are all the houses from the air. Here's the windmill. So it was completely blocked from the road. So people didn't see it when people would mention the windmill. Windmill? Your town has a windmill? There's the town hall. Here's the superette. Here are the superette cottages. There's my house. This is before the green. This is before the green. But it's summertime, and it's a postcard. And you can see Long Pond, you can see the chapel, you can see all the old houses and the cottages. I think this might be us playing out at the sidewalk. Not sure, we weren't supposed to play too close to the road. And this one might be the aerial with the green, yes. So in the end, all of these buildings, they were moved to Mill Road, some of them, two I think, and the rest were dismantled and the wood was used to build other homes. Because you always had to reuse wood. Yeah, I love that. And you'll notice the cedar trees aren't very tall or big. There's lots of open land here. I have one more thing from the archives. And it's because those of us from Eastham were not the first people to live here and love this area known as Nauset. And I want to share one of our collections in the archives that came from the original first peoples here, the Wampanoags and the Nausets. This is in the back cabinet, right in the back corner of this room. And it's an arrowhead collection that was donated by Kay Guild. It was found along Salt Pond Creek, all the arrowheads, on land that was owned by the guilds up until the 1970s. And a few years ago, an archaeological site form was filed with the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and it received its number, which they don't want people to give out, of exactly where it is and everything. So that's cut from this presentation. But the Guild collection is also featured in Dan Zotto's 2020 presentation called The Archaeology of Cape Cod, 13,000 Years of Native History. Now, this was our society's very first virtual presentation using Zoom during COVID. And wow, you know, he did a PowerPoint presentation. I have to tell you, we got, what do they call it? Bombed, or what did you do when people come in? Someone started writing things on the slides. But we fixed it up and it's perfect, and it's on our YouTube channel. And one of these cabinets, this one over here, has, this is the cabinet with all of the points from 10,000 years ago up until about 500 years ago. And Dan, there's an amazing book, and he's an amazing person, and it's just so fascinating. To close, finally, well, a few miscellaneous photos of Eastham to show just how much times have changed from the 20s and the 30s to the 50s and the 60s. This is the town pump and horse trough. It's at the intersection of Locust and Salt Pond Roads. As you can see, the old town hall. Here is Route 6. This is the town hall. It's before it was widened. It was before they took the hill down. This is Blanche Keefe's house, right beside us. You can hardly see it for the trees now. The highway was widened in 1936. Pretty sure it was 1936. And there's the schoolhouse, far right. And was this the Joseph's?
Joseph's house. It was
Joseph's
State
house.
Police Barracks.
Oh, right. The state police had their barracks. I'd forgotten about that. Yeah.
Do you know
But that was not so long ago.
Do you know the date of that?
It's pre-1936.
Is that a paved road or?
Yeah, that's paved. They did some paving in 1920, 21, I think. I love this photo. This is in the town hall, and it has a little bit of glare. This is the Orleans Inn. This is the cranberry bog. The main road is on the other side of Goose Hummock and to what it is now. Here's the Rotary. 1961. It was just built. This was Storyland and mini golf. This is in the 60s. Here's the Dairy Queen with its red roof right here. Is that Uncle Mertz?
That's Gills Up.
Gills
Orleans
Up.
Motors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Orleans Motors. That must be Goose Hummock.
Goose Hummock, yeah.
Yeah. And the main road is in orange. This was the main road before they put in the Rotary. And that's why they call it Cranberry Cove. And that's why it floods when it rains. Yeah. So it was very easy to put in the sources that I used for tonight's presentation because they're all from here and all in collections. And I just have to thank you for coming, and I really have to thank our archives volunteers because they're just phenomenal. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little something about the treasures that we've found in the archives, and just maybe you might be inspired to join us in the hunt by becoming a volunteer. I had to ask. Thank you.
Thank you.